Some intelligent people were never actually gifted. They were traumatized into becoming hyper-aware. And if you constantly notice things other people miss, feel emotionally exhausted around certain people, or somehow always sense tension before anyone speaks, this video may explain why you felt different your entire life. Some people become intelligent because they studied hard, because they had mentors, because life gave them room to grow safely. But some people became intelligent because their nervous system never got to relax. And that changes people permanently. If you grew up emotionally uncertain, your brain probably learned very early that missing emotional danger had consequences. So while other people were simply existing, your mind was scanning faces, tone changes, silence, tiny pauses, the typing bubble that suddenly disappears, that strange shift in someone's energy that nobody else notices. You became fluent in emotional danger before you even understood what was happening to you. And over time, that awareness became intelligence. Not the loud kind people notice immediately. Not the kind that dominates conversations. A different kind. The kind that notices mood shifts before anyone speaks. The kind that walks into a room and instantly feels tension nobody else sees. The kind that fake laughs in groups while secretly analyzing everybody's emotional state at the same time. And the strange part is, most people with this kind of intelligence don't even think they're smart. They just think they're tired. Because when intelligence is built through emotional survival, it doesn't feel impressive. It feels lonely. That's the part almost nobody talks about. Traumatic intelligence doesn't always look powerful from the outside. Sometimes it looks like overthinking, like rereading old messages for a hidden emotional meaning, like mentally preparing before social events, like needing hours alone after spending time with people, like staring at a text notification, feeling your stomach drop before you even open it. And underneath all of that, something deeper is happening. Your brain adapted to emotional unpredictability by becoming unusually perceptive, a smoke detector for emotional danger. Always listening, always scanning, always trying to predict what might hurt you next, which sounds useful, until you realize your nervous system never fully stops. That's why many highly perceptive people struggle to relax even in safe environments, because the thing protecting you may also be destroying your ability to rest, and that creates a strange contradiction. You become extremely good at reading people, while becoming emotionally exhausted by them. Your intelligence may actually be the reason relationships drain you so deeply, because while everyone else is simply hanging out, your brain is collecting emotional data nonstop. Who feels uncomfortable? Who secretly dislikes who? Who's emotionally shutting down? Who's forcing conversation? Who's pretending to be okay? And after enough years of this, you stop feeling relaxed around people entirely. Not because you hate people, because your nervous system learned that people are unpredictable. That's an important difference. A child who grows up emotionally safe usually develops curiosity naturally, but a child who grows up emotionally uncertain develops awareness obsessively. And people confuse the two all the time. That's why emotionally wounded people often seem strangely mature compared to everyone around them. Not because they wanted to grow up faster, because emotionally unsafe environments force children to study human behavior early. You learn to read silence like other people read language. You notice fake kindness immediately. You notice when someone's smile changes slightly. You notice when a person says, "I'm fine," differently than usual. You notice emotional distance before the relationship even changes. And eventually, this becomes automatic. You don't even realize how much your brain is analyzing anymore. It just happens, constantly, even during normal conversations, even while trying to relax, even when nothing bad is happening. And eventually, something painful starts happening. You begin feeling disconnected from people even when they're being kind to you. Because traumatic intelligence creates emotional depth, but also emotional distance. You understand people deeply, but struggle to feel understood yourself. That contradiction hurts more than most people realize, especially late at night, especially after social situations where everybody else seemed comfortable, but you somehow still felt emotionally outside of the experience. You laugh, you participate, you say the right things, but internally, there's always this invisible separation. Like part of you never fully arrives emotionally, and many people mistake this feeling for introversion, but sometimes it's actually emotional self-protection. Because people with traumatic intelligence often learned very early that vulnerability had consequences, so they became emotionally careful, extremely careful. You rehearse conversations before they happen, then replay them afterward. You suddenly remember someone's tone from 3 days ago, and your stomach drops for no obvious reason. You analyze tiny pauses in text messages. You wonder if your emotional tone changed slightly. You think about whether you sounded annoying, whether you shared too much, whether someone secretly lost interest. And over time, your mind becomes unbelievably sharp at reading possibilities, which sounds useful until you realize your brain never fully powers down. That's why highly perceptive people often feel exhausted after ordinary interactions, not because they're weak, because their mind never stopped adapting. And here's the part most people never realize. You were never overthinking. Your brain simply learned that missing emotional danger had consequences. That's the big difference. People call it anxiety, but sometimes it's pattern recognition built through emotional survival. And once you realize that, your entire personality suddenly starts making sense. The hyperawareness, the emotional exhaustion, the loneliness after social interactions, the need to isolate after overstimulation, the strange ability to read people instantly, the feeling that you somehow notice things other people completely miss. That isn't random. Your mind adapted differently. That adaptation became identity. And honestly, one of the saddest parts is how invisible it usually is. Because externally, you may look calm, functional, independent, even emotionally detached. But internally, your mind is moving constantly, comparing patterns, reading emotional energy, trying to predict outcomes, trying to avoid disappointment before it arrives, trying to protect yourself before anyone notices you're vulnerable. And eventually, this creates something painful. You become excellent at understanding others while quietly feeling emotionally unknown yourself. That loneliness becomes difficult to explain, especially when people assume intelligence automatically makes life easier. Sometimes, awareness makes life heavier, because once you start noticing emotional inconsistency everywhere, it becomes hard to stop. You notice how often people lie to themselves, how often people perform personalities just to be accepted, how often people hide resentment behind politeness. And once you see those patterns, you can't fully unsee them. That's why many people with traumatic intelligence feel emotionally older than their actual age. There's a certain tiredness in them, a certain emotional realism, not pessimism, awareness. And strangely, many of them become deeply compassionate because of it. Pain made them gentler with other people's emotions. They know what emotional neglect feels like, what emotional confusion feels like, what emotional abandonment feels like. So they become unusually careful with things most people overlook: tone, timing, silence, delayed replies, tiny emotional reactions. The problem is, they rarely offer themselves that same gentleness. People with traumatic intelligence are often hardest on themselves because survival mode thinking creates impossible internal standards. You blame yourself for emotional shifts you didn't cause. You overanalyze moments nobody else even remembers. You stare at a conversation afterward, wondering if one tiny sentence changed everything. And sometimes, you apologize even when you weren't the one who got hurt. Not because you're weak, because your nervous system learned that preventing conflict felt safer than expressing pain. That changes relationships more than people realize, especially romantic ones. Tiny changes in texting patterns suddenly feel massive. A shorter reply can quietly ruin your mood for hours. Not because you're dramatic, because your brain was trained to search for instability before it became abandonment. And people who haven't lived this way rarely understand how exhausting it is, how tiring it feels to notice everything while pretending you don't, how lonely it feels to constantly understand others emotionally while struggling to explain yourself. But here's something most people never talk about. Traumatic intelligence isn't only pain. Sometimes it becomes wisdom, real wisdom, not performative internet wisdom, the quiet kind, the kind that makes you emotionally observant, the kind that makes you patient with struggling people, the kind that makes you value sincerity more than status, the kind that makes you recognize loneliness in strangers almost instantly. And maybe that's why emotionally wounded people often connect deeply with people they barely know, because they recognize invisible pain immediately. In tired eyes, forced smiles, emotionally flat voices, silence that feels heavier than words. People who develop this kind of intelligence often become emotional safe spaces without even trying, because others can feel that you understand suffering without needing explanations. And ironically, that's usually because you spent so much of your own life feeling emotionally unseen, so you naturally notice what others ignore. But the most important thing to understand is this. Your hyperawareness was never proof that you were broken. It was proof that your brain adapted creatively to emotional uncertainty. Your intelligence formed differently. That's all. Not cleaner, not easier, but deeper. And yes, sometimes painful. Because people like you often spend years believing they're too sensitive when they're actually highly perceptive. There's a difference. Sensitivity feels like weakness to people who don't understand emotional depth. But perception changes everything. It changes how you experience conversations, relationships, trust, rejection, loneliness, even silence, especially silence. Because people with traumatic intelligence usually learned very early that silence carried emotional meaning, sometimes danger, sometimes disappointment, sometimes emotional withdrawal. And once your brain associates silence with emotional uncertainty, you never hear silence the same way again. That's why your mind keeps searching, interpreting, preparing, trying to understand what changed. But eventually, if you heal enough, something beautiful starts happening. You stop using your intelligence only for survival and start using it for understanding, for intuition, for creativity, for connection, for seeing people clearly without losing yourself inside them. That's the transition many emotionally intelligent people never realize they need. Your awareness doesn't have to disappear. It just needs somewhere safer to live. Because the truth is, some of the deepest people you'll ever meet were shaped by emotional chaos they never asked for. And somewhere along the way, they became extraordinarily perceptive because they had to. Not to feel superior, not to feel special, just to survive emotionally. But survival changed them, quietly, permanently. And people like this usually experience love very differently too. Because when your brain learns to associate connection with emotional unpredictability, relationships become complicated in ways most people never realize. If this felt painfully familiar, you were never as alone as you thought. And if you've spent your whole life trying to understand why your mind works this way, there's a good chance the next video will explain even more.